So Mick Middles Martin Ryan are going to do a joint tribute for Steve. Whenever you're ready.
Milliken and Nesbitt.
I'm very quietly spoken.
Go on, Steph.
Yeah, that's okay. You okay? Can you hear? Everyone can hear? Yeah. I didn't realise we were going to have to follow Mike Gary, you know. But there you go. Both myself and Martin are recently old age pensioners, and we're talking about a time when we were 20, 21, and it's a strange thing because when you're back there watching Steve there, it's like the future's like a big solid mass. But time's arrow is a strange thing because when you get to this age, time doesn't exist, it's gone. You know, it's a really it's boom. And that's kind of why we're here, I think, to celebrate events that happened. Now, I don't know, a lot of people here wouldn't have been around in the punk times. Some would. I think just before I sort of speak to Martin, I want to mention that it was like the strangest era because punks, something Steve said, I think it was in Dave Nolan's book, that punks are very, very caring people. Yeah. And I think that's very, very true. And you go back to that time, if you walk Electric Circus in Manchester, Collyhurst, Manchester, you walk from Manchester Electric Circus, if you were dressed as a punk, or you didn't even have to be dressed as a punk, you just had tight trousers on, you'd get attacked. I think our car window got smashed a couple of times. I think Kevin Cummins' car got smashed up a couple of times. People, straight people, would attack punks, and punks were like, you know, lovely people, still are, and it created a kind of a camaraderie and a siege mentality against straight people in a way. And I think when we started, we wanted to do a fanzine ourselves called Gassed Up, and we went to meet Steve, well, Martin will tell you more, I think at the Ranch Bar, and he couldn't be more welcoming. There was no sense whatsoever of oh, you're invading our territory. It wasn't like that. It was like a very warm feeling. And Steve admitted that. I think Mike Gary said the same thing there. Steve was like the heart. I remember going to the ranch and like Steve was serving behind the bar, I think, and he sold Shy Talks on the side of the bar. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it was like he sort of had an aura around him, you know. And the other people who've spoken, I know certain people here have said the same thing, that Steve, a very special person, mate. You know, he galvanised a sort of an attitude that reacted against what was happening in the day. Because people actually read The Sun and believed it. They still do, don't they? You know, but most.
Well, I do, yeah, certainly.
Most. Right, so I just to move on from that. And do you remember, Martin, that the first time we met Steve?
I do. It was actually the Electric Circus. I could even say a story about Denise, but I won't say that. I won't embarrass him. But yeah, I think you took. It was actually Steve Scrivener, I seem to recall, who became Steve Solomar. He was the DJ. He was for the punk nights. He was the DJ at the circus. And you actually, we had our first Gassed Up. Shy Talk 2 was out, and you went to the DJ and said, "Do you want to buy a fanzine?" And he just said to you, "Do you want to buy a fanzine?" He pulled out a Shy Talk 2, and I think we just swapped as we did in them days. And as you're walking away, this guy run over and says, "I'm your rival," and of course it was Steve. And as Mick said, you know, he couldn't have been nice. Well, he has been ever since. I mean, he's been I'd say in them days, he very quickly became a very close friend. And he actually introduced, well, he gave me the number that night for our second issue of Whisper, the bassist out of the Drones, who also, three of the Drones became very close friends. the Pete the drummer, he didn't come out as much as the others. So that, although he's a nice bloke when I met him, but yeah, that's what Steve did. And then he introduced me to Paul Morley. I don't know, and that's where Denise comes in. But again, I won't mention that. I think Paul Morley was snogging somebody, and that's all I'll say.
You've probably gathered by now that there's two sides here, in that Martin actually remembers things properly. I remember not saying nothing really, and it's all bullshit from me. But I might remember the true stuff. And as an example of that, by the way, I've just written a 2,000-word review of Stiff Little Fingers at the Factory Club in Manchester. In-depth review. I remember every single thing absolutely perfectly. Although, after I finished it, I looked up and they never actually played there. You know, so that, I'm just saying, just to balance it, you know. So believe what he says, don't believe any of my shite. And that's but did you went to the next thing? You went to the Vortex. So every big gig in London, you went to the Vortex, didn't you? I didn't go to this.
Opening night of the Vortex, it was Crackers Disco in London on Wardour Street. I think it was one of Pete Stringfellow's clubs later on, but yeah, for the night it was the first night. And Buzzcocks were on with The Fall, actually, about the maybe fourth gig of The Fall. So, yeah, Steve told me, do you fancy coming down? I think it was a Monday, actually, it was the 4th of July. We all went down. Kevin Cummins actually hired a minibus and drove us down. There was myself, Steve, Anne was with us that night, and John Cooper Clarke was also came down. He was also on the bill. Sadly died of death the first time he performed in London. But yeah, I mean we saw Buzzcocks at Soundcheck. I think with Steve actually, he seemed to know all the other fanzine writers. He introduced me to Adrian Thrills, a guy called Adrian Thrills, who ran the fanzine 48 Thrills. And later on actually, when they were in Manchester with Generation X, he introduced me to another guy who he said, "This is Steve from 48 Thrills." And it was, I didn't know for many years later, it was actually the guy who became Steve Strange. Sadly no longer with us, but it was actually Steve Strange selling 48 Thrills in rafters. So yeah, it was, that was my second time in London. I think we went to the Roxy before that, didn't we? And yeah. Steve was there then as well. It's funny really, we leave Manchester to get away from Mancunians, and Ste Shy was always there.
I do recall a time we met Steve. Steve used to manage a band called The Worst. Anybody remember The Worst? And I remember we were sat in the Wolves that burned down in Piccadilly. We were sat in the cafe, and Steve was there, and this guy haranguing him, saying, "You manage a band, you put them on our cabaret club." And then it's like, we're not that sort of band really, you know. And he said, "Are they any good?" And he said, "No." And that was kind of the point of The Worst, you know. I mean, you know, it's like they weren't going to go down well. Do you remember this? And
yeah.
That same day, we walked down to see Martin Hannett, who was working in Music Force Promotions.
That's right, yeah.
Down, and Steve came down with us, and I was very proud this day. And we went in to interview Martin Hannett, who was then to be the legendary Buzzcocks. It was Buzzcocks, the legendary.
He did Martin Zero.
Yeah, Joy Division was in the future and all that. And but the phone rang and he answered it, and his girlfriend said, "I'm around." And he said, "I'm busy. I'm doing an interview." And he said, "Who are you talking to?" And Shy talk and gassed up. And I thought, "Well, he knows who we are," you know. And then they went, "Oh well, there you go then. If it's that important today." Do you remember that?
I do, yeah. I mean, there's the other time as well when Steve said, "Do you want to come and meet?" It was actually the Nosebleeds, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously, we're still Headbanger, but when they truncated the name to the Nosebleeds, because it sounded less punk than Headbanger and the Nosebleeds, I suppose. That was actually good. One of the best things he did for us then, because as you recall, Vinnie Farl, who taken over managing them, he was playing us all with booze all the day. Once he was giving us bottles of pills, because he was very keen that the fanzine should cover his band, because he thought we had more clout than the national press. Which maybe was true, I don't know.
I remember we
got free beer anyway, so I mean, it was he did us a favour there.
I remember extraordinary night at the Roxy in London, which is the famous punk venue in London. The heart, it's about as big as this actually, only far rougher. And XTC were playing, and I think originally they were going to play with Buzzcocks supporting.
Yeah, but I've only found this out recently, but yeah.
And it was a wild night. Steve came down.
Steve,
yeah. And it was a night that it was. What it was. They'd hired out the Roxy Club to these punks, these rubbish punks, you know, Andy Chizovsky and that running punk, and they hired this out, and then suddenly started getting loads of press, and then they wanted it back, so they kicked them out. The actual owners wanted it back, so they kicked them out, and this was the first night that the old owners had taken over the Roxy Club. And I remember Steve coming down and we were chatting to him about this, and Paul Morley was there because he was managing the drones. Buzzcocks going to support, they pulled out, the drones jumped in, loved the drones, they're playing later on, you know, I'm not knocking the drones, but they kind of jumped in, and there's a massive scrap on there. Do you remember that?
It was, and it was Sarge, wasn't it, who's worked with Buzzcocks as well, I believe.
Yeah.
Sarge was actually the roadie for the drones, and I think he was a bit of a minder when anything kicked off.
We saw this, because these are things that we saw together with Steve, and the guy in front of us picked up a table and hurled it down, smashed all over the place. And someone was actually hurt, I think, and Steve turned around to me and said, "Do you know who that was?" I said, No. It was Tony Parsons from the NME. And then I didn't meet Tony Parsons about 20 years after that. And I said to him, look, I've got a bone to pick with you, mate. You just smashed up this place. And he went, it wasn't me. I didn't do that. Didn't do that. You know, but he did. And he said, well, I was there that night. Yeah, he obviously did. But it was a classic night, really, wasn't it? Because it was like the twist of punk. You know, it was one of those kind of weird nights. And we had a few. We went to Sheffield.
Yes.
The drones were very close to the Stranglers, weren't they?
Yes, they were supporting the Stranglers on their Rattus tour in '77.
Yeah, and did Steve come over with us to Sheffield?
Steve, I think you gave me a lift in your car. Well, you gave both of us a lift in your car.
Yeah.
And you actually brought, those who remember Paul Doyle, who hitched everywhere, you actually gave him a lift back.
Do you remember him? Oh gosh. He used to dress in
bandages and
had a light bulb, and he'd hitch, and he'd moan because like no one would pick him up, you know.
He had nothing.
What became of him?
He went down to London, but we don't know what happened to him.
You not heard from him? No one's heard from him since?
He tried so hard to find him.
Oh, right.
He was in the Hacienda and then he was moving to London. But
Did he?
Seen him. Somebody said he sadly has passed away, but we hope he hasn't, and we're hoping meet up with him one day. Yay!
Yeah.
This is Denise and Deb, by the way, old icons of the Manchester. It wouldn't have been the same without people like that. It really wouldn't. And it was a special time, wasn't it? You know. I don't know where to go really from there, because the only other thing, when we were welcomed in by Steve, and we didn't know what we were doing. We were idiots, you know, basically. And Steve had already done the first one. When we decided to do gas stuff, when 1976 came around, I moved to the Lake District. You know, that's how when I was. You know, I was like at the zeitgeist. Although having said that, the little village I lived in, Silverdale, there's more sex and drugs and rock and roll went on there than ever happened in Manchester. That's the day, though. That's a different story. Came back at the end of '76, and we decided to do this fanzine, and it's like, you don't know, we didn't know how to do it, did we? Cause
no, we just said let's do it, and then we contacted, well, and that's the story, I contacted Buzzcocks through New Hormones, and I didn't know then what would happen if you write to a band, you know, if you write to United Artists, say, I want to interview Dr. Feelgood. I guess in Lee Brillock or Wilco wouldn't ring me back, but in the case of Buzzcocks, actually Pete Shelley did ring me back. It was Pete Shelley who actually rang me, well, at my parents' home, but I picked up the phone, and said, it's Pete Shelley at Buzzcocks. And now, had we gone down to the ranch, as Steve later took us, you know, I would have known that actually you can rub shoulders with Pete Shelley anytime. But I didn't know, so it was a big deal that a guitarist out of a band, alright, they're only an independent band, but he'd rang my house. So then we had to decide, you know, how do we print one? Well, we're going to have to, because they're expecting us on Saturday. So
It was a extraordinary thing. I remember walking into Rough Trade in London, and Jeff Travis, that had a Rough Trade, later became the big, the big label head. We had the badges on saying we're from Gassed Up, and he went, Gassed Up from Manchester, Gassed Up in Shito, and he knew everything about. I mean, this stupid bloody fanzine now. It wasn't any way. It wasn't. Sorry, Mike. It wasn't as good as Steve's, to be honest with you. But it had its moments, didn't it? You know.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, like I say, we're a lot younger then, so.
I have to say, I love to see Deb's there wearing a T-shirt with Shy Top. It looks fantastic, actually. It does look iconic, that. I mean, there wasn't anything else really back then. It was like, and it passed quickly. But Steve, I must admit, throughout the years, just moving on, I've met Steve many times at gigs, and it was like touching base. Going, way up until going to the Dulcimer in Chorlton, and God knows, all kinds of gigs really that you wouldn't expect. And I know Steve came out of a funk tradition. He wasn't really a rock person. He came out of funk and soul. That was his thing. As were a lot of punks from London, strangely enough. I think the Bromley contingent were soul fans, weren't they?
Well, it's strange in that way because, as you say, Steve and Paul Doyle, I believe, was from the year before he'd been a soul boy. And yet we've been, into Led Zeppelin, The Who, and Deep Purple and the like. We were totally other side of the spectrum.
We were on hip, is what you're trying to say.
Well, I don't know. Oh, we were hip and they were on hip. I mean, it's depends on your point of view. But it's funny how we were total. I think Steve said he went to see the Fatback Band the year before. Yeah. And say I would have seen Hawkwind perhaps. And yet a year later we were seeing exactly the same bands. So I don't know. It did bring the various factions together.
I think we'll probably wrap this up now. We've covered the Manchester punk scene fairly quickly, and it's just like been a privilege to know Steve over the years. Still is, absolutely. And Martin. And I shall go home tonight and I shall read Shy Talk again. It's always a good read. Also, I mean, we tried to get Steve Morris down, He's not here, is he? No, he's not, is he? Because without Shy Talk, Steve Morris would never have joined Joy Division. That's obviously the story. And that was, those sort of links. I don't really he's even aware of that, but that is true. And he did put it in his book, didn't he? He did put it in his book. In fairness, and life would have been different, and little things change. When somebody like Steve comes along, he has something about him that changes other people's lives, and probably loads of things that Steve doesn't know that we don't know have happened because of Steve. And I think that's the place to leave it.